Hi, I'm Trina Turk, and you're listening to U.S. Modernist Radio. Oh, look at that woman has a Vieyra bag. Oh. One of the new Vieyra bags.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world. I'm Tom Guild. Today, you'll hear a sunny, breezy, colorful conversation about Wildwood, the Palm Springs of the Jersey Shore. No, not where Snooki and The Situation spent their misspent youth. That would be Seaside Heights. That's way to the north. Wildwood is actually 3 towns along a 6-mile barrier island near the southern tip of New Jersey. That would be Wildwood Crest, Wildwood, and Wildwood North, famous for a colorful array of over 300 wildly themed motels, providing families wonderful vacation memories for decades. Staying in Wildwood was the first exposure to modernism for millions of Americans. You'll hear from Daniel Vieyra, Professor Emeritus in the Kent State University School of Architecture, Stephanie Hoagland, Principal and Architectural Conservator of Jablonski Building Conservation, and Ian Smith, Principal of ISDG Architects. But first, your host, who has never been to Wildwood, but now wants to, George Smart.
Thanks, Tom. Before last spring, I had never even heard of Wildwood. How did I miss all these great buildings? Wildwood was a tourist mecca for families in Pennsylvania and New Jersey, featuring modernist motels, hundreds of them, inspired by the glamorous hotels of Miami designed by architects like Morris Lapidus. Some of these in Wildwood not only took the names of his hotels, such as the Eden Rock, but their shape, color, lighting, and features. By the 1960s, Wildwood was hosting over 2 million visitors a year, middle and working class patrons who lived and worked in traditional houses for the most part. But for a week or two each year, these families were immersed in a wonderland of modernism. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs, and by modernist realtor Angela Roll. In a story that we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll worked her way through college, dancing like no one's watching to Mambo No. 5 and brilliantly house-flipping Neutra, sometimes simultaneously. At 22, following a celebrity-filled party at a famous hillside L.A. modernist house involving diving off the roof into the pool, absolute Le Mans, and a new use for WD-40, Angela was recruited to the architecture school, where after years of sleep-deprived design studios, she's now a modernist real estate agent with specialized training, advising buyers and sellers on everything from appropriate renovation to saving a completely doomed mid-century house from destruction. That last one is true. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550. In June, I spoke on a panel at the DOCOMOMO National Conference in Philadelphia. DOCOMOMO is a nonprofit friend of U.S. Modernist, and their name stands for the documentation and conservation of the modern movement. Founder Theo Proudhon and Executive Director Liz Wakus have been guests on the podcast. We had the well-received panel presentation about Wildwood in the morning, and later that day I reconvened the speakers over drinks in the lobby of the downtown Philadelphia Marriott. That's what you'll hear in the background. Here's my conversation about Wildwood with Daniel Vieyra, Professor Emeritus in the Kent State School of Architecture, Stephanie Hoagland, Principal and Architectural Conservator with Jablonski Building Conservation, and Ian Smith, Founding Principal of ISDG, an architecture firm in Philadelphia. So Daniel, set this up for us about where is this place and what's so special about it?
Okay, what is special is actually what was special about it.
Okay.
It was at the end of the extension of the Garden State Parkway, which was finished in 1955, and it is a barrier island off the coast of Philadelphia that became a very special place. On the eve of the 21st century, we suddenly kind of rediscovered the innocence that was gone from the middle of the century, and Wildwood was literally a time warp. And so it became a resort where you could relive. It was like a real live Disney, is really what it was.
Oh.
So it was Disney, but people did die in Wildwood.
And people did not, right. And people generally know where Atlantic City is because that gets all the publicity.
Right.
And this is what, like an hour south of
Yes.
Atlantic City?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's between Atlantic City and Cape May, and yeah.
This area was very popular for a long time. The landed gentry, the wealthy people, would go there in the 1800s, right?
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, Stephanie, where did people stay in the 1800s? What was it like then, and how did it evolve?
At that time, they were really staying in primarily boarding houses, and then there were some larger hotels. There was quite a large number of them. And then kind of over time, as the car kind of became more of the car culture, those kind of were replaced by the motels in the Wildwoods.
And so we go through into the 20s, and it changes into that car culture motel kind of era. But the big boom that we're all here to celebrate didn't happen till about when?
It started probably in the mid to late 1940s with the smaller kind of court-style motels, and then moved from there to kind of bigger motels. And a lot of them would build like one story, and then as business increased, they would just add on another story and then another story, which kind of really changed the look of some of these motels, but made some of them a little more interesting.
Now, you were involved early on in a study that visited all these. Tell us about that.
So I went to Columbia University for graduate school, and one of their criteria is that you have to do a summer internship. And so I did mine with the Doo-Wop Preservation League in the summer of 2001, where I lived down there, and I spent the entire summer surveying over 300 motels that were constructed in the 1950s and 60s, along with some other government buildings and commercial structures and restaurants, really to kind of try and form the basis to create a historic district for Wildwood.
And how many of them were there when you were there doing that study?
I surveyed, I think, about 319 motels, and then there were additional, commercial structures on top of that. But it went from North Wildwood all the way down to Wildwood Crest, just one after the other, the entire length of the island.
Daniel, what were some of the kind of themes that these hotels took on? Because they really kind of became Marvel's superheroes of their own with different appendages and shapes and sizes and signs.
Right. Well, there was a whole series of stories that could be told by the signs alone, and sometimes they were told by the signs supplemented by some architectural tweaks and twists. And the themes were a whole grab bag of popular culture. So they had primarily, I think, try to organizing the chaos that is the reality, where you have a piece of Florida next to a piece of the Caribbean, is kind of a daunting task. But you had everything ranging from the car itself, like the Bel Air, which itself has kind of several meanings. As a car, that imagery was kind of reinforced by the themes of the motels. There were chevrons. It was the classic car color. It had roof lines that were kind of called to mind the car. But it was everything from the car to royalty of the fantastic kind to the real kind, and tying it to Philadelphia in particular. There's the Royal Monaco Hotel, Royal Purple Monaco Hotel. And that was a faraway place in terms of Monaco, but it was also basically a few neighborhoods away where Grace Kelly grew up.
Oh, really?
Yeah, as a Philadelphia icon. So it was this kind of neighborhood made bigger than life. So the Royal Monaco Hotel was referring to a faraway place, but also a few neighborhoods
Princess
away
Grace,
from you.
right.
Right, Princess Grace, yeah.
Now, Ian, what was the allure of this place, of Wildwood, for families? Why did they want to come?
Well, from what I've learned and what I've studied is that I think they were trying to find a place away from their daily...
The drinks are here.
Their
This
daily
is what makes the interview
burn.
really rock and roll here.
Excellent.
And we're
I don't know if I should continue, but
Yeah, you
your
keep
drink
talking.
looks mighty fine, I have to say. It's pretty wonderful. And the Manhattan as well. Well, in some ways, it's kind of poignant that we're getting our drinks right now because this was about recreation. At least that's the way I like to think about it, where you're recreating yourself, trying to reform perhaps your more festive or, party lifestyle as opposed to your work lifestyle, which was, generally a part of the clientele that was coming down in the late 50s and early 60s. So definitely recreation, sun and sand and family and drinking and eating and getting together.
Did they have liquor by the drink at the coast then? Was that a thing? Because I know in the South, of course, we didn't have it for decades, but did they have that in Wildwood during the 50s and 60s?
There was and it still holds true today. There's entire streets that are really just dedicated to bars and entertainment venues. And I think that was another one of the attractions, is that a lot of the kind of resort towns, at least in New Jersey, are dry. They're kind of religious based. And so, again, Wildwood was one of these places that you could just go crazy. And they still have foam parties, and you can just go and get drunk and have a good time. But with that came all of this amazing music that came out of there. I mean, like Chubby Checker introduced the twist there. Dick Clark started American Bandstand, for TV down at one of the amusement piers. So it's really, really enmeshed in American culture and good times.
Well, let's have a toast to Wildwood.
All right.
Absolutely. Cheers.
Yay,
Cheers to
Wildwood.
everybody.
Cheers to everybody. There we go.
Okay.
Don't spill on the equipment.
Ooh, that's strong. That was a strong drink.
Yeah. Stephanie, how did the idea for this being a festive place with design kind of leading the way come about? I mean, because obviously not everybody was doing this in their communities. So who was spearheading this in Wildwood?
You mean in like the 1950s?
Yeah, when it started.
I don't know that it was necessarily led with design. I think it was really, a lot of it was led just by fun and entertainment. Because you had so many motels on the island, you needed something that would grab your eye, or the tourist's eye, as they're going past. And that's why a lot of these motels look exactly the same, except for their signage or the appendages. And so it was really a way of, getting attention and getting the tourists to pick my motel versus your motel. I mean, granted, some of the design did come from the Morey brothers, who vacationed down in Florida at Miami Beach, and they, brought back a lot of the ideas with them and kind of incorporated them into their own motels. So there are a lot of design ideas that you see, and even names of motels that you see from Miami Beach and Palm Springs brought to the Wildwoods and then kind of recreated.
I think one of the things to keep in mind is that when families went to the Wildwood initially, they didn't necessarily reserve. They drove up and down the streets and decided where they were going to stay on the spot.
Oh, really?
So, yes.
So
and
they
in
were
fact,
shopping.
They were shopping.
Oh, yeah.
And so the eye candy was particularly important.
Right.
So
And
wait a second. Let me see if I can get my hands around this in this age of reservations. So they drove to a resort, drove up and down the highway, and let these buildings beckon them as to where to stay.
Well, keep in mind, this is a car
That was
culture.
one of the attractions
Right.
of
That
the
was
Wildwoods.
one of the attractions.
Well, it's a car culture, right? Like to this very day, you can go up there and not have a reservation.
Yep.
You're looking in the parking lot to see if there are any open spaces, right? And if there are, there might be a vacancy, and that's where you go and kind of set yourself up, which is, a part of that culture. It's just like going to a drive-in, right? Drive-in movie theater,
Wow.
you're going and looking for that space.
Yeah.
That's pretty fantastic.
Yeah.
Did Wildwood get copied by other communities in New Jersey or elsewhere? Because it seems like it reached a really critical mass with so many hotels and bars and restaurants and venues and so forth. Or was that more of an anomaly there on the East Coast?
I might speak to more of the anomaly. I think Stephanie can probably speak to this a little bit, but in my studies, I found that Wildwood was in direct competition with Atlantic City. And part of the reason why Wildwood, allowed people to drink in their city is because they were trying to steal people away from Atlantic City at one point in time, which allowed them to perhaps take advantage of a moment in time when Atlantic City was dry and really kind of change the possibilities for Wildwood.
Change the balance of power.
Yes.
Was there ever any thought that Wildwood would become the next gambling destination versus Atlantic City?
Not that I know of. I don't think that there was ever And that was kind of actually one of the things that kind of helped lead to the downfall for Wildwood during the 1970s and 80s, is that there were all of these other places that offered big name entertainment and gambling,
Right.
and Wildwood didn't offer any of that anymore. You know, they
Although
had
for-
C-list celebrities, like David Cassidy and that kind of stuff, which, in the 80s people weren't really that excited about. But, Atlantic City did draw a lot of people away. And things like Six Flags and other amusement parks that had bigger coasters than Wildwood had.
There is a very brief chapter where people in Wildwood were talking to some Native American tribes about setting up
Oh,
casinos.
really?
Yeah,
Yeah?
I had forgotten all about that, but yes.
Wow.
And that didn't work out. Huh?
No, it didn't work out. But it didn't work out in part because this was, I'm sure there were legitimate impediments to doing it, but also it was at a point where it seemed as if the whole doo-wop character and making themselves a living Disney was going to be really the ticket to the future.
Yeah. Now, Ian, for our audience that is in their 20s, tell them what doo-wop is.
Doo-wop. Well, it is a song styling or sort of vocalist styling that occurred on street corners. And it was something that I think it was a rite of passage, or even like sort of a sign of prowess. If you could get with your friends and harmonize really well. And if you could manage to get a strong 4-part harmony, much like a barbershop quartet, you were doing pretty good. And then all you had to do was add that nice swing to it. You get the beat, and the doo-wop. You get the bass vocalist on there, and you had something going on. I think you were going to attract a few ladies with that.
This was your street cred, right?
Yeah, this is street cred. Yeah.
And did the town attract like competitions for this or conventions, or how did that kind of evolve in association with the city versus just the habit of having these groups?
So I think that at the time the motels were so popular, it was never really considered doo-wop. I don't think it really started to be called doo-wop until Steve Eisner and other people came in and started, this is how we're going to kind of reclaim and remarket.
Yeah, it's kind of like
Wildwood.
we didn't call anything mid-century modern
Exactly.
until much later
Yeah.
than the actual
Yeah.
time.
Exactly.
But it does have significant cultural meaning.
Yes.
Because at the time this activity didn't happen. And it was the emergence of youth culture. I mean, the real sort of embrace of rock and roll and how it came about from its origins to its more refined adolescent stage, if I might say.
Yeah. And there is a large group of people that really think that, rock and roll came from Wildwood, that all of this music, this is really where rock and roll started. Other towns will defy that claim, but that's one of the claims that Wildwood likes to make.
Yeah, I'm surprised they didn't put like some sort of Hall of Fame there like they do in Cleveland for the Rock and Roll
Yeah.
Hall of Fame, right?
Well, I know they tried. I don't know the detail of that, but I know there was some interest behind that. But not anything really formal like a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, but like a sort of that mid to late 50s kind of radio play dynamic with these singles, one-hit wonders and all that kind of culture behind that. Radio culture.
Good old radio, right?
Right.
Who was the big DJ in Philadelphia at the time?
Dick Clark, right?
Was it Dick Clark was?
Dick Clark.
Okay.
Yeah.
These vacations also took on what sounds to us now like a luxurious length. Families would come down for a whole week or two, generally from the Philadelphia area. Sometimes they'd stay a month. Sometimes the father generally would be the one that drives back during the week and goes back to work and then comes back on the weekends to be with the family, and the family's just here frolicking there on the beach. I mean, this sounds like a great model, right? Mm-hmm. And part of the attraction for being able to have something also be so close.
Right.
Yeah, it's like the working class version of the Catskills. I mean, it was the same way. They had their entertainment, the family stayed up for the whole summer, and dads came up for the weekend. This was just a little, I don't want to say lower class, but it was more like a working class version of the Catskills.
Yeah, I'm surprised we didn't see the Goldbergs on TV go to.
That's one thing
Go
they
to
left
Wildwood.
out.
Yeah.
A little bit.
They did cover on the Goldbergs, just since we're here in Philadelphia, the legend of Donkey's Place in Camden,
Ah.
which is supposed to have the best cheesesteaks, and it's in New Jersey.
I'm not familiar with that, actually. I'm ashamed to say. I should know.
Actually, something that I know nothing about, but that you raised as an interesting question is apparently there were neighborhoods not only of the physical motels, but of where you went to vacation with your neighbors.
Oh,
That is
So,
true.
Yeah,
That is
so
true.
there was an ethnic element to the divisions within the Wildwoods.
this is like the Amish moving from Ohio every year, going down to Sarasota. You know, hundreds
In a
of
way,
them come
in a
together.
way, yes.
Yeah.
Because there were some motel owners when we were doing the workshop, we had design clinics with motel owners to tweak certain things about their buildings or offer a certain level of amenities. And we had a whole discussion with the owner, actually, of the Bel Air Motel at the time about the need to focus on their key market. And it had to do with barbecues and food and everything. And he said, we need to keep our clientele that we have. And then it sounded exactly like a neighborhood just moved from Philadelphia to the shore.
Yeah.
And that was his market.
Yeah.
And he needed to be sure that the design improvements were consistent with that.
Now, the sad news here is that as opposed to 20 years ago when there were 300-some motels, how many are there now, Stephanie?
I don't know the exact number right off the top of my head, but I know that when I went down in 2018, of the 319, 121 had been demolished. And about 94 had been converted to condos.
Oh.
So they had all of the signage and all the fun stuff kind of stripped off to make them very, middle of the road and non-offensive. So that's kind of where we are now. I know that several additional have been demolished since 2018.
Was there any one or two that were kind of the flagship, like the iconic ones?
I think, yes. I mean, there's so many different motels that were iconic in their own right. And so, like, the Fantasy is gone, the Ebb Tide is gone. There were a lot of them that were really visually spectacular that are just gone.
That are all gone now.
Yeah.
Now, this was all great if you were white. But if you weren't white, not so much.
Well,
So what was that like if you were a black family and you wanted to go down to Wildwood for the
well,
week?
that wasn't going to happen. Let's be honest. I mean, like, I think ultimately the culture had been put in place far before the 1950s, and I think African Americans, had a culture actually down in Cape May at the very, very end, and to this very day is well established. So there is some other places called, I think, Chicken Bone Beach, right, which is another place where African Americans did reside and entertain themselves. Beyond that, you might know a little bit more, Stephanie, but...
I don't, unfortunately. But I know that, as you've shown, and
Right.
I've seen in a lot of the postcards, you aren't seeing any black faces
No,
in
definitely not.
those publicity
And the
shots and the
advertisements,
postcards.
no.
I mean, I think something that came up just now in this conversation that didn't come up before is that it's a really powerful thing when families vacation together, right? And again, this is a contemporary thing as well because, going through COVID, we kind of had to group up where families would get together and sort of try to quarantine together, in this kind of shutdown. In much the same way, this was a culturally significant component to kind of secure your, comfort level, making sure your kids had something to do and they were safe and your wives were safe. And, especially if the husband was going back to city to work, I would imagine you want all these kind of things built in, to it, making it a wonderful vacation that you spent your money well on, right?
When you guys were doing research on this, were there rules against people of color, or not necessarily rules, but just sort of practice of keeping them from checking into the hotels in the 50s and early 60s? Do you know?
I can't really
Don't
speak to that.
know.
I haven't seen anything that was written down or
Yeah, policies or
obvious.
procedures, much like we've seen in other cases. No, I haven't seen anything like that. And it might have just been because of the activities that had happened perhaps 50 years prior, maybe like in the late 1800s, early 1900s, 1920s, 1930s, that kind of didn't really operate out of those places without probably running into some conflict. And so it was probably really well established by the time of the 1950s, 1960s.
Now, there were a lot of people of color who were working in the establishments, working in the restaurants, and I learned today that they lived nearby, but not really in these areas we're talking about. They were on the kind of north side.
Right, and I might want to try to sort of adjust that just a little bit, where the sense that they're probably working there but not seen, as much as opposed to being visible. They weren't really like the service class, right, or the concierge kind of class. They were probably more about the labor that you wouldn't see, sort of getting things established.
Back of the house.
Back of house, deliveries, maybe cooks, something like that, but nothing front of house.
Now, what is it like today in terms of diversity of the motels and the families that come down there now? Is it more mixed or?
I can speak to kind of a generation ago.
Yeah.
And it was definitely much more mixed. And some of the neighborhoods, I wouldn't go so far as to say they were African-American neighborhoods, but they were definitely clusters of motels where you could see, when we were just there for the summer, you could see that there was a shift and there was a definite clientele for motels of a variety of backgrounds.
And I'd like to add, like, even in the ownership, right? Like Eastern Asian ownership of motels.
Right.
I've seen a lot of that in the recent era as far as transition, which, is part of a new trend. I would say they tended to get a benefit, but when we think about this market, it's really about real estate. It's really about ownership. It's being about buying in. And even though I know this probably doesn't exist in the ordinance, I never read it anywhere about restricting people of color from purchasing properties, but I would imagine there's probably underlying practices that prevented them from being able to buy into the neighborhoods, for a time.
Before the Civil Rights Act and so forth eliminated most of all of that. One of the publications that most people who are not of color don't know about is called the Green Book.
Oh, yeah.
Which was a guide for black people to go not only on vacation, but just to travel in general, what was safe for them to do, what roads to travel, what places to avoid, where they could stay safely, where they could eat safely, all of that. So how did that develop throughout New Jersey? Where were the places that were good for families to go?
A lot of that culture did exist in Philadelphia. There were places for people to stay when they were traveling or entertaining, and I'm sure there were probably places in southern New Jersey as well. I would imagine if we went to an older Green Book, we'd probably see some locations in Cape May, for sure. And then probably a little bit west of sort of the shore area or the Cape, the edge of where the ocean is and whatnot. You probably see some places identified in the book there as well.
Has anyone done a documentary yet on Wildwood?
I don't think a full-length one. I know that you can purchase hour-long, kind of a mini documentary at the Doo-Wop Preservation League Museum, but I don't know if it's been a full-blown, the Burns brothers have not been there yet.
Okay. Okay, good. Well, I'm thinking this might be a job for Jake Gorst, who's filmed a lot of architecture documentaries, take his crew down to Wildwood and do some photography. Where is the history? Where are the archives of all of this stored? Where are the old documents about Wildwood in the 50s and 60s and these motels that have been destroyed? Where is all that kept now?
So there's several places. They do the Doo-Wop Preservation League does have a museum. There's also the main history museum that they have in Wildwood, and it's right kind of on the main street. Actually, when I did my thesis, I got a lot of the information from the buildings department, in terms of who was constructing these materials, the motels, and when. And even places like eBay and Card Cow, you can find a ton of postcards and motel brochures and all this other kind of stuff, ephemera, that you're not necessarily going to find at the museum, because not every museum has every postcard from every motel. But, places like eBay and Card Cow, they're
eBay
great
is
sources.
Good.
Yes.
eBay's good.
Yeah.
The place is Wildwood, New Jersey. Put it on your list of places to visit. Thank you all for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thanks for listening. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Diane Bald and the Budman family, restoring significant architecture in Toronto, Los Angeles, Malibu, and Palm Springs. And by Modernist Realtor Angela Roll. Okay, Tom, take us out.
Visit usmodernist.org's massive archives to listen to past shows, discover documentation of 15,000 significant modernist houses, and access 4 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. Neither of our archivists, Carrie Cesarino or Kelly Policelli, have been to Wildwood. I've not been to Wildwood. Are you thinking what I'm thinking, George?
Road trip.
There you go. U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive Incorporated, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. I'm Tom Guild. George and I will be back soon with another Modernism Down the Jersey Shore edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.